As we continue looking through the Bible story here during this year, we want to think about, as we enter a second section, we've been thinking about the beginning in the first section of the Bible story, and now we enter into a second section that we may call the Exodus. Now, when we concluded the story of Genesis, we see that Joseph had died, and he had given instructions that his bones would be brought out of Egypt in Genesis 20 and verse 25, in a clear reference to the promises that God had made, that Joseph knew that God was going to fulfill these promises just as he had said to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, entering into the second section of the Bible story moves us forward in time, and we'll see that conditions have worsened for God's people in Egypt. And this was foretold. You go back into Genesis chapter 15 and look at verses 13 and 14. Then the Lord said to Abram, "Know this for certain. Your offspring will be resident aliens for 400 years in a land that does not belong to them, and will be enslaved and oppressed. However, I will judge the nation they serve, and afterward they will go out with many possessions." And so, as we continue to look through the Bible story, we pick up now as Israel is in Egypt, and we want to see the conditions of Israel at that time when they are living in Egypt as we come into the book of Exodus in particular. Well, Israel, we see in the early parts of Exodus chapter 1, we see that Israel went from being a large family. You look at verses 1 through 5, and you see the descendants here of being 70. It was already there in Egypt, and this was going back some time during this time when, back in Genesis, that we saw Jacob's family move down to Egypt. But now what we see is that they are extremely numerous in verse 7. But the Israelites were fruitful, increased rapidly, multiplied, and became extremely numerous, so that the land was filled with them. But what we notice is as the number of the Israelites are growing and growing in the land of Egypt, that there's a new king. There's a new Pharaoh of Egypt that comes to power at this time. And he didn't know Joseph. He didn't know all that Joseph had done for him and had done for Egypt, as we read at the end of the book of Genesis. Look at verse 8 of Exodus chapter 1. It says, "A new king who did not know about Joseph came to power in Egypt. And he made a determination. As he looked and saw this nation and how this nation was growing, he determined to deal harshly with the Israelites and put them to forced labor as slaves in the land," as you look at verses 9 through 14 of Exodus chapter 1. He's concerned about the Israelite people. Look at verse 9, are more numerous and powerful than we are. So he says, "Come, let's deal shrewdly with them. Otherwise, they will multiply further, and when war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country." And so we see the Egyptians then putting Israel to forced labor, and how they built these cities, and they became oppressed, but yet the more that they oppressed them, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. They worked the Israelites ruthlessly and made their lives bitter with difficult labor in brick and mortar and in all kinds of field work. They ruthlessly imposed all this work on them. So we can see the conditions of the Israelite people, though they are growing in number according to God's promise, but yet they are being put to this very difficult labor. And then you also see that Pharaoh then instructs that the male children born to the Israelites then were to be killed, ultimately by throwing them into the Nile River. In verse 22 of Exodus 1, Pharaoh then commanded all his people, "You must throw every son born to the Hebrews into the Nile, but let every daughter live." And interestingly, then, it is at this point that we are introduced to Moses. As Moses was born during this time of Egyptian slavery and this time when the boys that were born to the Israelites were being thrown into the Nile River. But Moses' God-fearing parents decided instead to hide Moses along the banks of the Nile, as chapter 2 of Exodus goes on and shows in the first 4 verses, and how for a while this couple hid their son for 3 months. But it says in verse 3 that when she could no longer hide him, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with asphalt and pitch. She placed the child in it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. Then his sister stood at a distance in order to see what would happen to him. And there, during this time, Pharaoh's daughter found Moses and adopted him. Verses 5 through 10. As Pharaoh's daughter went down to bathe at the Nile while her servant girls walked along the riverbank, she saw the basket among the reeds, sent her slave girl, took it, opened it, and saw him, the child. And there he was, a little boy, crying. She felt sorry for him and said, "This is one of the Hebrew boys." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Should I go and call a Hebrew woman who is nursing to nurse the boy for you?" "Go," Pharaoh's daughter told her. So the girl went and called the boy's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse him for me, and I will pay your wages." So the woman took the boy and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, because, she said, "I drew him out of the water." And so we can clearly see that here is Moses, and how Moses does not end up like, assumingly, so many of the male children at that time born to the Israelites in being cast into the Nile River, but instead was kept alive and even adopted by Pharaoh's own daughter. And then as we move forward in the story, when Moses was about 40 years old, according to Acts 7 and verse 23, so we jump ahead about 40 years, and we see that Moses then went out to his people, the Hebrews, the Israelites, and he saw how they were mistreated in chapter 2 and verse 11, and saw the forced labor, and saw an Egyptian striking a Hebrew, one of his people. And we see that Moses then killed the Egyptian in verse 12 and hid him in the sand. But of course, this news of this came out. News of this got around, and to the point that even Pharaoh heard about this, and he tried to kill Moses. So Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian. So we can see just some early seeds here about Moses and the environment that Moses is born into, why Moses flees from the land, and then this is going to tie into what we'll see next. But meanwhile, we're told after a long time passed, the king of Egypt died, and the Israelites cried out to God for help, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Look at Exodus 2, verses 23 through 25. After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned because of their difficult labor. They cried out, and their cry for help because of the difficult labor ascended to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the Israelites, and God knew. Well, now, as we continue on through this story, we see that Moses is sent to Pharaoh. When Moses was shepherding, and he came to Horeb or Sinai, the mountain of God, we see that he turned aside whenever he saw the sight of a bush that was burning but not being consumed. Look in Exodus chapter 3, the first 3 verses. Meanwhile, Moses was shepherding the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Then the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire within a bush. And Moses looked, and he saw that the bush was on fire but was not consumed. So Moses thought, I must go over and look at this remarkable sight. Why isn't the bush burning up? And from this bush, we see that God called Moses to go to Pharaoh. We read starting in verse 4. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from the bush, Moses, Moses. Here I am, he answered. Do not come closer, he said. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he continued, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people in Egypt, and have heard them crying out because of their oppressors. I know about their sufferings, and I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians, and to bring them from that land to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the territory of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. So because the Israelites' cry for help has come to me, and I have also seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them, therefore go. I am sending you to Pharaoh so that you may lead my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. So God has now called Moses. He's going to use this Moses to lead his people, to help accomplish the promises that God had made. Despite Moses' objections, God promised that he would be with him and would lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Verses 11 and 12, Moses asked, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, that I should bring the Israelites out of Egypt? But God answered him, I will certainly be with you, and this will be the sign to you that I am the one who sent you. When you bring the people out of Egypt, you will all worship at this mountain. Moses was then to say that the I Am, that is the God of their ancestors, had sent him to deliver Israel. Verses 13 through 17, Moses asked God, if I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What should I tell them? And God replied to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is how I am to be remembered in every generation. Go and assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has appeared to me and said, I have paid close attention to you and to what has been done for you in Egypt, and I have promised you that I will bring you up from the misery of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. And he was to go to Pharaoh, requesting that the Israelites go on a 3-day trip into the wilderness to sacrifice to God. Verse 18. They will listen to what you say. Then you, along with the elders of Israel, must go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Now please, let us go on a 3-day trip into the wilderness so that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. However, what we see is that God knew that the king would not listen, and God promised, though, they would still leave Egypt after miracles and plundering the Egyptians in verses 19 through 22. However, God says, I know that the king of Egypt will not allow you to go, even under force from a strong hand. But when I stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my miracles that I will perform in it, after that he will let you go. And I will give these people such favor with the Egyptians that when you go, you will not go empty-handed. Each woman will ask her neighbor, and any woman staying in her house, for silver and gold jewelry and clothing, and you will put them on your sons and daughters, so you will plunder the Egyptians. Moses, we also see, was given miraculous signs. He was also given his brother Aaron as his spokesman. He was given the signs of being able to cast down his staff, and it would turn into a snake, and then he could pick it up and it would turn back to a staff, or put his hand inside of his garment and pull it out and it would become leprous, and then put it back in and pull it out and it would be healed, and also the sign of water turning into blood. So then, as Moses is sent to Pharaoh, we see the 10 plagues. You see, Pharaoh did not receive the message from Jehovah God because he did not know this God. Exodus 5, verses 1 through 5 says, "Later Moses and Aaron went in and said to Pharaoh, 'This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival for me in the wilderness.' But Pharaoh responded, 'Who is the Lord that I should obey him by letting Israel go? I don't know the Lord, and besides, I will not let Israel go.' They answered, 'The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Please let us go on a 3-day trip into the wilderness so that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. Or else he may strike us with plague or sword.' The king of Egypt said to them, 'Moses and Aaron, why are you causing the people to neglect their work? Get to your labor.' Pharaoh also said, 'Look, the people of the land are so numerous, and you would stop them from their labor.' So Pharaoh did not receive the message that Jehovah God, the I Am, had sent to him to let his people go, because he didn't know this God. In fact, what we see is that Pharaoh then forced the people to even more difficult labor after this. And the people would complain. But yet God still promised to deliver Israel so they would know that Jehovah is their God. Look at chapter 6 of Exodus and verses 2 through 8. Then God spoke to Moses, telling him, 'I am the Lord. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty, but I was not known to them by my name, the Lord. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land they lived in as aliens. Furthermore, I have heard the groaning of the Israelites, whom the Egyptians are forcing to work as slaves, and I have remembered my covenant. Therefore tell the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from the forced labor of the Egyptians and rescue you from slavery to them. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and great acts of judgment. I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. You will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from forced labor of the Egyptians. I will bring you to the land that I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord." Following this, then, God brought a series of 10 plagues on Egypt, and you can read about that through chapters 7 through 12. And we see God turning water to blood, frogs being brought upon the land, and gnats or some sort of biting insect, flies, the death of livestock, boils and hail and locusts and darkness, and the death of the firstborn. All of these terrible plagues, but yet Pharaoh's heart was hardened by the instruction God had given to let the people go, and he stubbornly refused. And through these great signs that God performed, he was making it clear that he is Jehovah God, and he is the one who is worthy of worship and service. Look in Exodus 7 and verse 5. It says, the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the Israelites from among them. Later in chapter 8, verses 20 through 23, we see as, again, Moses was telling Pharaoh to let God's people go, but if you don't, here's these swarms of flies that will be sent, and the Egyptians' house will swarm with flies, so they will land where they live, and so will the land where they live. But on that day I will give special treatment to the land of Goshen. Remember, that's where God's people are, the Israelites. No flies will be there. And he says, this way you will know that I, the Lord, am in the land. I will make a distinction between my people and your people. This sign will take place tomorrow. So all these references to knowing Jehovah God is God, and he's worthy of worship and service. In chapter 9, verses 13 through 16, again, we can see this instruction of letting my people go. And this time, here's all these plagues against Egypt. But notice, then you will know there is no one like me on the whole earth. By now, God says, I could have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with a plague, and you would have been obliterated from the earth. However, I've let you live for this purpose, to show my power and to make my name known on the whole earth. And then in chapter 10, verses 1 and 2, then the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his officials, so that I may do these miraculous signs of mine among them, and so that you may tell your son and grandson how severely I dealt with the Egyptians and performed miraculous signs among them, and you will know that I am the Lord. Just notice throughout all of these plagues how this reference is continually made about through these God, that people would know that Jehovah God is God. Prior to the final plague, which of course was the death of the firstborn, God also instituted the Passover so that the Israelites would remember what God had done for them throughout the generations. In chapter 12, verses 24 through 28, you can read about this, how they were to remember when the Lord passed over those who had placed the blood on the doorframe of the house and spared them from death. And interestingly, God used these plagues on Egypt to defeat the various Egyptian gods. Look at Exodus 12 and verse 12. I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night and strike every firstborn male in the land of Egypt, both people and animals. I am the Lord. I will execute judgments against all the gods of Egypt. God would execute the judgments against all the gods of Egypt. And he did that through the plagues and just showing how great he is in comparison with their gods, as each of the plagues had connections with. Next, we notice then, after the 10 plagues, that Israel is delivered. So at the conclusion of the 10th plague, Pharaoh sent the Israelites out of Egypt as God had said. Let's read in Exodus 12, verses 29 through 32. Now at midnight the Lord struck every firstborn male in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and every firstborn of the livestock. During the night Pharaoh got up, he along with all his officials and all the Egyptians, and there was a loud wailing throughout Egypt, because there wasn't a house with someone dead. He summoned Moses and Aaron during the night and said, get out immediately from among my people, both you and the Israelites, and go worship the Lord as you have said. Take even your flocks and your herds as you asked, and leave, and also bless me. And then in verses 40 and 41, we can see that, again, just as God had said, the time that the Israelites lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, on that same day, all the Lord's military divisions went out from the land of Egypt. Remember, just as God said back in Genesis 15 to Abram in verses 13 and 14. God had promised to bring his people out of Egypt, and now, as he has defeated the Egyptian gods, and he has shown his greatness to both the Israelites and the Egyptians, and then even to others, that they are brought out of Egypt. And then in addition, we see that the Israelites carried Joseph's bones with them. Exodus 13, verse 19, shows that Moses took the bones of Joseph with him because Joseph had made the Israelites swear a solemn oath, saying, God will certainly come to your aid. Then you must take my bones with you from this place. You can go back to Genesis 50 and look at verses 24 and 25 through all of that. God led them on their journey from Egypt here by means of a pillar of cloud during the day and a pillar of fire during the night. Exodus 13, verses 20 through 22. And then the Lord gave instructions that would make it appear to Pharaoh that the Israelites, that they were wandering in confusion after they left Egypt, and so Pharaoh and his army would chase after them, and God would receive glory through what he would accomplish. Look again here in Exodus 14. You can read the first 4 verses, but notice as this confusion would happen, we see that God says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart so that he will pursue them. Then I will receive glory by means of Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. So the Israelites did this. Well, when Pharaoh heard about this, Pharaoh and his army pursued Israel, and Israel was afraid. But yet Moses urged them to stand firm. Verses 13 and 14, Moses said to the people, don't be afraid, stand firm and see the Lord's salvation that he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you must be quiet. The Lord then gave instructions concerning what the Israelites must do to receive the deliverance that he would provide. Look at verses 15 through 18. It says, the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to break camp. As for you, lift up your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea, and divide it so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. As for me, I am going to harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them, and I will receive glory by means of Pharaoh, all his army, and his chariots and horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I receive glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. Well then, as Israel crossed the Red Sea, as they did what God said, God fought for Israel and saved Israel by defeating the Egyptian army. Look at verses 29 through 31 of the 14th chapter. But the Israelites had walked through the sea on dry ground, with the waters like a wall to them on their right and their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the power of the Egyptians. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. When Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and believed in him and in his servant Moses. So God provided the deliverance, allowing that Red Sea to be parted and the Israelites to walk across on dry ground, and then closing that wall of water on the Egyptians. And we can see how they recognized the power of God and the glory of God. And after this, as you move into chapter 15, we see that the Israelites praised God for what he did. Then Moses and the Israelites, in chapter 15, verses 1 through 6, sang this song to the Lord. They said, I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. He has thrown the horse and its rider into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song. He has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him. My father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. He threw Pharaoh's chariots and his army into the sea. The elite of his officers were drowned in the Red Sea. The floods covered them. They sank to the depths like a stone. Lord, your right hand is glorious in power. Lord, your right hand shattered the enemy. And we even see how this would all cause others to fear. You keep going and you can read verses 11 through 18, but just verse 11, for example, Lord, who is like you among the gods? Who is like you, glorious in holiness, revered with praises, performing wonders? And how others could take note of this God, the God of Israel, Jehovah God. Well then, moving from Egypt, we see Israel travels from Egypt to Sinai. Having been delivered from Egypt, they still needed to learn to rely upon God. And God led the people from the Red Sea to the wilderness of Shur, where they were 3 days without water, to Marah, where the water was bitter, to Elim, where there were 12 springs and date palms, to the wilderness of Sin, where the people grumbled for food, and eventually to Rephidim, where the people complained about water and fought the Amalekites, the first battle that they faced as they came out of Egypt. But through it all, even though they often complained through this time, they needed to be reminded of how God continued to provide and how God would deliver for them, would deliver them. And he did. And you can read in Exodus 16, verses 4 through 8, how he provided manna and quail. And God promised to take care of them if they obeyed him. In Exodus 15 and verse 26, he said, if you will carefully obey the Lord, your God, do what is right in his sight, pay attention to his commands, and keep all his statutes, I will not inflict any illnesses on you that I inflicted on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. And then we see from Rephidim, Israel traveled to the Sinai wilderness and Mount Sinai. And this is where God had called Moses from, as we kind of began, or at least early on in our account in this lesson. And God extended his covenant to the people. Let's read Exodus 19, verses 3 through 8. Moses went up the mountain to God, and the Lord called to him from the mountain, this is what you must say to the house of Jacob and explain to the Israelites. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, if you will carefully listen to me and keep my covenant, you will be my own possession out of all the peoples, although the whole earth is mine, and you will be my kingdom of priests and my holy nation. These are the words that you are to say to the Israelites. After Moses came back, he summoned the elders of the people and set before them all these words that the Lord had commanded him. Then all the people responded together, we will do all that the Lord has spoken. So Moses brought the people's words back to the Lord. So as we close this lesson, we see that God has kept his promises, and a large number of Abraham's descendants have been delivered from Egypt. Now they're on their way to becoming the nation God promised they would become, and to inherit the land God promised to give. But before this, they will spend some time at Sinai to learn what God desires for them as his people.